General Hospital Spoilers reveal that Sidwell had always known the weight of walking too close to fire, but until now he had never realized that the heat could be absolute, consuming, final. The empire that Sonny had built across Port Charles wasn't merely constructed on money and muscle, but on psychological control, fear, and the unspoken understanding that anyone who dared to cross a boundary would disappear without trace. Sidwell had crossed far too many lines, orchestrated too many betrayals, manipulated too many lives under the illusion that he was untouchable. But now, as Sonny moved with the quiet fury of a man no longer content with subtle retaliation, Sidwell felt something he hadn't experienced in years, true fear. And in his desperation, he reached for the only card he believed could stop the coming execution, Morgan. Not a memory. Not a ghost. But a living, breathing possibility. Something Sidwell had hinted at only in whispers before, a piece of truth wrapped in madness. A secret so profound that it could undo everything Sonny believed about life, death, and the grief he had swallowed like poison. In the hours before Sonny's men closed in, Sidwell unleashed his most dangerous play. Through encrypted messages and carefully placed clues, he sent word that he possessed proof, photographs, recordings, even biological samples, that suggested Morgan had never died in that explosion. That somewhere, somehow, Morgan had survived and had been hidden, perhaps even manipulated or used. And that Sonny had been mourning a ghost while his son lived in the shadow of a darker conspiracy. The possibility cracked something inside Sonny. For years, he had buried that pain, tied it to rage, and used it to fuel his war on everyone he deemed responsible. Morgan's death had reshaped him. It made him colder, less forgiving, more explosive. The mere suggestion that his son was still alive ignited not just grief but fury. If Sidwell was lying, he would die slowly. But if he was telling the truth, if Sonny had been mourning a lie, then every moment since the funeral had been a theater of cruelty, a performance of sorrow under false pretenses, and someone would have to pay for that betrayal with more than just blood. Sidwell was not afraid to die. But he was terrified of dying without a legacy, without a final manipulation to his name. His mind, twisted by years of survival at any cost, had convinced itself that offering Sonny a resurrection would earn him absolution. But Sonny was not a man who granted forgiveness easily, especially not when it came to Morgan. The balance between truth and madness teetered violently as Jason began to investigate Sidwell's claims under silent orders from Sonny. What Jason uncovered wasn't definitive. But it wasn't dismissible either. There were traces, digital footprints, unaccounted for transactions, medical records sealed under aliases, that pointed to a young man matching Morgan's description being treated in facilities outside the U.S. under strict supervision, often in isolation. Always under pseudonyms. It was enough to awaken every dark instinct in Sonny's body. Liesel, who had recently unearthed her own trauma in finding Britt's grave empty, cautioned restraint. But Sonny could not think in terms of caution. The thought of Morgan, locked away, manipulated, perhaps even turned into something he would no longer recognize, shattered whatever clarity Sonny had left. His grip on reality frayed. His decisions became erratic. And still, he hesitated to kill Sidwell. Because Sidwell now represented not a traitor, but a gatekeeper to a truth that could either save or destroy everything Sonny had become. In a private bunker, far from the watchful eyes of law enforcement or allies, Sidwell was kept in isolation. Sonny visited him daily, not with fists but with silence, staring at him like he was trying to read his soul, to see if this was another con, another layer of deception. And Sidwell reveled in the attention, in the twisted power he held. He spoke in riddles, dropped names, hinted at experiments and reconditioning. At psychological warfare used on the young man in question. He never once confirmed Morgan by name. But he didn't have to. The seed was planted. And it grew, poisonous and invasive, inside Sonny's already tormented mind. Meanwhile, Carly felt the aftershocks of this obsession without even knowing the full truth. Sonny's distance, his violent moods, his late-night disappearances, they all mirrored the period right after Morgan's presumed death. She feared he was spiraling again. Jason tried to intervene but could not reveal the cause. Liesel, torn between her own grief over Britt and her loyalty to Jason, warned that if this conspiracy about Morgan was real, then Port Charles was about to be pulled into a vortex of revelations that could undo everything. The walls began to close in. Sidwell's contacts started dying, silenced by factions who didn't want this truth to surface. A digital file containing possible footage of Morgan in captivity was erased remotely seconds before Jason accessed it. Sonny's safe houses were breached. People he trusted were bought off or turned. It was no longer just a game of retribution. It had become a war of erasure. Someone out there wanted all traces of Morgan's potential survival buried for good. And yet, Sonny could not stop. Each new clue brought him closer to a version of truth that terrified him. What if Morgan had been turned against him? What if the years of psychological conditioning had made Morgan forget who he was? What if he had been used to build another empire, one fueled by pain and lies? Sonny's rage turned inward. The grief he thought he had mastered erupted again, devouring logic. Sidwell, even as a prisoner, remained smug. He had broken Sonny without lifting a finger. And if Sonny killed him, the last breadcrumb would vanish forever. Then, one night, Sonny stood over Sidwell, a gun in his hand, ready to end the nightmare. Sidwell simply smiled and whispered that killing him would make Morgan vanish forever. But sparing him meant Sonny was weak. It was a trap. A torment. And Sonny, paralyzed by the need for answers, lowered the weapon. He would not give Sidwell the satisfaction of control. Jason, in secret, continued the hunt. He followed trails to Eastern Europe, tracked hospital records buried under intelligence files, interviewed former mercenaries who claimed to have seen a man with Morgan's face but not Morgan's eyes. Sonny's obsession became Jason's burden. And back in Port Charles, Carly's heart began to fracture under the weight of not knowing. Donna and Avery felt the tension, the silence, the absence of emotional stability. Even Drew, caught in his own web of manipulation and downfall, began to sense that the return of Morgan, even as a rumor, could destroy what little peace was left. Sidwell's gamble had worked. He had derailed Sonny's control, infected Jason's purpose, shattered Carly's security, and awakened a storm that could no longer be contained. Whether Morgan was truly alive or not no longer mattered. The damage had been done. The possibility alone had reignited every buried pain, every old betrayal, every unsolved mystery that had once defined the Corinthos family. And as Sonny stood before Sidwell one final time, he no longer saw a man, he saw the embodiment of every nightmare that had ever stalked his family. In the end, Sidwell's survival would depend not on truth, but on whether Sonny could live with the chaos he had unleashed. And somewhere, perhaps still hidden, perhaps already watching, Morgan, if alive, was no longer just a son. He was a question no one could answer, a ghost with the power to destroy the living, and a legacy that would haunt Port Charles until the truth finally came to light. Under mounting pressure and personal torment, Sonny stood at the precipice of decisions that no man should ever be forced to make, especially not one who had already seen too much loss. The tension that saturated Port Charles had become unbearable, woven with a labyrinth of lies, betrayals, and shadowed ghosts of the past, none more haunting than the possibility that Morgan, long thought dead, might still be alive. For months Sonny had chased rumors, dismissed fantasies, and rejected false hopes, clinging to a hardened grief that had etched itself into his soul. But when Sidwell, cornered, desperate, and inches from death, made a final, unexpected move, everything changed. With Sonny's gun pointed directly at his heart, Sidwell didn't beg. Instead, he offered something no enemy had ever dared, evidence that Morgan might be alive. He spoke in measured tones, his voice cracking under the weight of both fear and urgency, outlining a twisted story of secret transfers, experimental drug trials, and a conspiracy that dated back to the night of the so-called explosion. He claimed Morgan had never been in the car, that someone had taken his place, that Morgan had been moved by shadowy operatives in a plan designed to punish Sonny by stripping him of the one thing he loved most, his son. Sidwell, he said, had been a pawn at first, but eventually became a player. He had documents, voice memos, even grainy footage from a secure compound that showed a figure resembling Morgan, alive, restrained, calling out in confusion. It was enough to freeze Sonny's finger on the trigger. That hesitation, that flicker of a father's hope, was all Sidwell needed to shift the balance of power. He didn't ask for mercy, he negotiated it. In exchange for his life, he would hand over every scrap of information he had, leading Sonny to a facility buried deep within a remote location that no map displayed. And Sonny, unable to walk away from even the slimmest chance of reclaiming his son, agreed. But that choice came at a cost. Forgiving Sidwell wasn't just about mercy, it meant inviting chaos. It meant trusting a man who had burned down his world more than once. It meant breaking the very code Sonny had sworn to uphold in blood and silence. And yet, the pull of a father's love overpowered the laws of the streets. Carly raged at the decision, her fury uncontainable. She had buried Morgan once. She had mourned him, let his ghost settle inside her, and watching Sonny resurrect that ghost reopened wounds that hadn't healed. Michael stood somewhere between devastation and disbelief, unwilling to let hope bloom, terrified that it might destroy him. Jocelyn, hardened by her own battles, refused to believe anything until she saw proof. Dante, though torn, saw what this meant to Sonny and silently helped investigate Sidwell's claims. And still, the evidence mounted. Sonny began to spiral, consumed by the obsessive need to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it was. As he peeled back layers of deception, he discovered an operation far more sinister than he had imagined. Morgan had not only been taken, he had been manipulated, drugged, and used as leverage in a larger plan to control Sonny's empire from the shadows. It explained the erratic moves, the betrayal within his ranks, the slow dismantling of his influence across territories. Every enemy he had faced in recent years had been operating under a single directive: keep Sonny destabilized and distracted by grief. Now, as he prepared to retrieve Morgan, Sonny faced the chilling realization that his son might not be the same young man who had once smiled so freely. The boy with impulsive passion and wounded eyes might have been broken into something unrecognizable. Britt, still healing in secret exile after faking her own death, heard whispers of the mission and reached out through coded channels. Aware that her medical expertise and experience with neurological trauma could be the key to restoring Morgan if he truly had survived. Liesel, haunted by the weight of her own secrets and the loss of Britt, found herself pulled into the orbit of this madness once again. Desperate to help, but also terrified of what it would mean if the dead kept returning. The line between justice and obsession blurred for Sonny. He told himself it was about redemption, about correcting a wrong, about giving Morgan a life that was stolen from him. But the truth was simpler and darker. Sonny needed to believe that he had not failed his son, that he had not let his own enemies destroy his family from within. The further he delved into the mystery, the clearer it became that Sidwell had not been acting alone. Names began to surface: old enemies, hidden allies, ghosts of the cartel, and even whispers of Victor's influence stretching beyond the grave. If Morgan had been used as a puppet, then Port Charles was the stage for a war long in the making. The deeper Sonny chased the truth, the more isolated he became. Carly filed emergency custody motions for Donna and Avery, terrified that Sonny's recklessness would swallow their daughters in flames. Mina, fractured and spiraling from her own betrayals, watched the man she had once loved fall into the same darkness that had taken everything from her. Even Jason, loyal and stoic, began to worry that Sonny's grip on reality was slipping. But none of them could stop him. Not now. Sonny had made his choice, and it had consumed him. The mission to bring Morgan back wasn't just a rescue, it was a resurrection. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. Morgan's return, if real, would not be a joyful reunion. It would be the beginning of something far more dangerous. For every ghost that rises, something must be buried in its place. And Sonny, standing on the edge of that grave, knew he might not survive what came next. But he also knew this. If his son was still out there, broken or whole, lost or twisted, then he would bring him home or burn the world down trying. Morgan's return to Port Charles was anything but a miracle. It was a psychological reckoning wrapped in chaos. When Sonny finally brought his son back, the man who stood before him was not the same Morgan who had once stormed through life with wild passion and fragile volatility. What returned was someone shattered, reassembled by years of trauma, isolation, and manipulation. Morgan's eyes were clouded with confusion, his speech fragmented, and his memories hauntingly unreliable. The son Sonny had longed to hold again had become a symbol of something far more disturbing, the cost of obsession, the fallout of power, and the ghosts that never stay buried. This version of Morgan, erratic and unstable, became a mirror to Sonny's own unraveling. No longer a grieving father but a man who had crossed every moral line to claw back what fate had taken. Sonny now had to confront the consequences of what it meant to resurrect a life meant to stay at peace. Morgan suffered from psychological disorientation, lashing out unpredictably, haunted by delusions fed to him during his captivity. His episodes grew violent, unpredictable, and terrifying, especially for those who remembered the warmth of the boy he once was. Carly, stunned by her son's reappearance, was torn between maternal hope and sharp fear. The boy she had mourned now stood before her alive but so changed that she could barely recognize him. And as Morgan became more volatile, Carly's rage turned toward Sonny. She blamed him not just for the chaos of Morgan's reappearance, but for the path that had led their son to this damaged state. She accused Sonny of using Morgan as a weapon to justify revenge, of prioritizing his pride and need for redemption over their son's well-being. Every conversation between them turned into a battlefield. Accusations flew, old wounds reopened, and long-buried grief transformed into fresh fury. The fallout spread like wildfire. Donna and Avery, already struggling with the fractures between their parents, were now thrust into an environment charged with emotional instability. Michael, devastated by his brother's return in such a broken form, began to resent Sonny all over again, unable to understand how a man could claim to protect his family and yet endanger them with every choice he made. Jocelyn, once close to Morgan, now avoided him entirely, unable to reconcile the warm sibling memories with the stranger who walked through the Corinthos home. Port Charles was not prepared for Morgan's return. Whispers spread rapidly, questions about where he had been, who had held him, and what experiments or control he may have endured. But more alarming was the reality of what he had become. Morgan's presence disrupted every room he entered. He'd stare too long, mutter names from the past, or rage over shadows only he could see. Some claimed he was dangerous. Others believed he was a victim. But all agreed, Morgan was not the same. Sonny, however, refused to give up. He placed Morgan under constant care, built a team of specialists, and even called in Britt, still in hiding after faking her death, to provide confidential neurological assessments. Britt, shaken by Morgan's condition, suspected long-term psychological manipulation, possibly even experimental drug therapy. What she could not answer, though, was whether Morgan could ever recover, whether the man he used to be could still be found beneath the wreckage. But Sonny didn't care about impossibilities. He had crossed too many lines, made too many sacrifices, to let go now. He watched over Morgan day and night, convinced that if he remained steadfast, his son would come back to him completely. He ignored Carly's demands for hospitalization, rejected her accusations of playing God, and shut out anyone who questioned his decisions. This was no longer just about family, this was about control, about proving he could fix what had once been destroyed. Carly, in turn, began preparing for legal action. She sought emergency custody of Donna and moved to prevent Morgan from staying in the Corinthos estate, citing emotional danger to the children. She met with Diane, compiling medical records, therapist reports, and even secretly recorded footage of one of Morgan's episodes. She was determined to protect her daughters, even if it meant dragging Sonny through a vicious public custody battle. Their feud escalated into public spectacle. Port Charles watched as its once golden couple self-destructed in front of the cameras. Friends took sides. The media speculated. Ava, ever the opportunist, offered to testify for Carly if it meant weakening Sonny's grip on his family. Nina, desperate to cling to her place in Sonny's life, tried to mediate. Only to find herself increasingly alienated. Even Jason, once Sonny's unwavering enforcer, began to question whether his loyalty was becoming complicity. And through it all, Morgan remained the unstable center of the storm. Sometimes lucid, sometimes lost, he floated between moments of heartbreaking clarity and terrifying unpredictability. He called out for Kiki in the middle of the night. He smashed mirrors searching for a face he didn't recognize. He once screamed at Sonny, begging to be taken back to the facility, claiming he was safer there. Each moment drove deeper fissures into a family already on the brink of collapse. Sonny's empire began to feel the weight of this unraveling. Rivals sensed weakness and moved in. Business meetings failed. Associates whispered about the boss who lost control. Some even speculated that Sonny might be preparing to step down. Unable to juggle war on the streets and war within his home. But Sonny, hardened by grief and guilt, only pushed harder, his love for Morgan becoming a fixation. His mission to restore his son eclipsing every other responsibility. Carly, pushed beyond her limits, delivered an ultimatum. Either Sonny committed Morgan to professional care or she would go public with everything, his failures, the secrecy, the danger to their children. She no longer saw him as a protector, but as a man so consumed by penance that he was willing to destroy everyone around him just to feel redeemed. The tension reached its peak one stormy evening, when Morgan, in a confused and frenzied state, disappeared from the house. Alarms were triggered. Security fanned out across Port Charles. Carly blamed Sonny. Sonny blamed himself. And by the time they found Morgan, soaked, shaking, huddled in a cemetery by his own empty grave, everything had changed. Sonny wept. Carly stared in silence. And Morgan, in a rare moment of clarity, simply whispered, "I don't belong here." That whisper echoed throughout Port Charles. It became a metaphor for everything the Corinthos family had become, fractured, haunted, and trapped in a cycle of resurrection and ruin. Morgan's return was no longer a miracle. It was a reckoning. And Sonny and Carly, standing on opposite sides of the fallout, now faced a future where even their greatest love, their child, could not heal the damage already done.